Good morning and welcome to Trinity Baptist Church. This morning we come to the end, for the time being at least, of our series looking at the life of David. And I say for the time being because as you'll see when we get there, there's at least one big part of David's story that we haven't quite got to yet. And so it may well be that we come back to David later in the year. But from next week, instead, we're going to turn our attention to Lent, which is the period of preparation for the celebration of Easter. And that begins this coming Wednesday, which of course means that Tuesday is Pancake Day. It's my favourite day of the year. And I don't know about you, but I'm starting to get excited already. Anyway, this year for Lent, we're not able to hold a Lent course in the way that we have done for the past few years. But instead, we want to encourage the whole church to take part in a Lent devotion series, which is produced by the Church of England, but don't worry, I think it sounds despite that. And it's called God's Story, Our Story. And we've got these books, which we're going to distribute to you over the next couple of days before Wednesday. So if you haven't received one by Wednesday morning, get in touch with me, because it might be just that something's gone wrong. But like I say, hopefully you will have it before Wednesday morning. And inside these books there are 6 reflections for each week. One for each day, excluding Sundays, which are traditionally considered as feast days. And so they aren't actually included as part of the 40 days of Lent, which if you've decided to give up chocolate or something similar for Lent, it is handy information to know that you can have Sundays off and still do your 40 days of Lent. Anyway, back to the devotion series. Each day there is a short reading and a reflection and an activity to do or to think about. And these are all contained within the booklet. Or if you prefer, there's an app that you can download so that you can have it on your phone or on your tablet. And the link for the app will be on our website and on our Facebook page from later today. And we really do want to encourage all of you to take part in this. It's not a huge undertaking. It reckons it will take between kind of 8 and 10 minutes each day. And as I said the other week when we had our communion service, that act of doing something together, whether it is taking communion or if it's studying the same passage of scripture or kind of reflecting on the same issues or praying for the same things as one another, all these things help us to stay connected as a community during this time when we're not able to physically be together. So do look out for these books being delivered to you, or download the app if you prefer, and then enjoy your pancakes on Tuesday, ready to begin this Lent devotion series together from Wednesday. And our sermons for the next 6 weeks during the period of Lent are going to tie into the themes that are contained within this series too. And so that means that, as I've already said, this week is the last one for the time being in our series looking at the life of David. And we're going to end, for now, back where we started at the beginning of January, with the procession into Jerusalem as David brings the ark into his new capital city and back into prominence at the heart of the nation of Israel. The story can be found in 2 Samuel chapter 6, and you'll remember that the previous chapter, chapter 5, that we looked at last week was where David was appointed king, and so you can see already that this is one of his first acts as king of Israel. And the story itself is quite a strange one, and with kind of lots of different things going on. So I'm just going to tell the story first, and then we'll have a look at a couple of the different parts of it in a little bit more detail. Now, anyone who has ever seen the film Raiders of the Lost Ark will have a kind of pretty good sense that the Ark of the Covenant was a big wooden box that you seriously don't want to mess with. The ark is first described in the book of Exodus when the Israelites would carry it with them through the desert. The box, with 2 winged cherubim on top, was filled with 2 stone tablets inscribed with the 10 Commandments, some manna, as well as Aaron's rod. And whenever the ark was with them, the Israelites felt like they were invincible, unbeatable. Except in the 4th chapter of 1 Samuel, the unthinkable happens. The Israelites go up against the Philistines, and they've got chariots, and even with their ark, the Israelites were no match for them. And so the Philistines capture the ark. Only it then begins to make all the Philistines who are near it sick. And so they decide to return it to the Israelites. But now, even though Israel got the ark back, the people weren't happy with it. They were kind of afraid of it because of what it had done to the Philistines. And this is also the moment where the people kind of gang up on Samuel and demand a king so that they can be like the other nations. And amidst all the ensuing changes and chaos, the ark gets kind of forgotten about. It becomes a sort of dusty relic kept in the town of Kiriath Jearim. But now that David had become king, he decides to sort of dig into the past and to retrieve the ark and use it to unite the people around him. And so he gathers together all of the able-bodied men in Israel. And we're told that there were about 30,000 of them in total. And they go off to Kiriath Jearim to collect the ark from Eleazar, son of Abinadab, under whose care it had been kept for at least the past 20 years. And they make a new cart to transport the ark back to Jerusalem, and then they begin to make their way towards the capital, with the sons of Abinadab, Uzar and Ahio, either side of the ark, taking care of it. And we're told that David and all the people with him are kind of dancing and celebrating as they make their way with the ark towards Jerusalem. And they've got musicians playing and all sorts. It would have been quite a sight, like a sort of huge carnival procession as it wound its way through the hilly region of Israel. However, disaster strikes as when they reach the threshing floor of Nakon, the cart is jolted by the oxen that are pulling it, and Uzar reaches out his hand to steady the ark. In that moment, we're told that the Lord burst forth against Uzar, and he died there beside the ark of God. The procession comes to a halt. I imagine there's a sort of mixture of bewilderment and distress, and David becomes angry and fearful and asks, how can the ark of the Lord come into my care? So he decides that it would be safer for the ark not to be brought to Jerusalem. I think he kind of decides that he doesn't want it anywhere near him. And instead he sends it to the home of Obed-Edom. And we're told that whilst it's with him, the Lord blesses Obed-Edom and his family during that time. After 3 months, then word of this blessing reaches David, and so he decides to have another crack at bringing the ark to Jerusalem. This time, however, there is no cart. The ark is carried, and a sacrifice is made as the ark begins its journey for the second time. Once again, David and the people dance and celebrate as the ark makes its way into the city. This time, David is dressed in an ephod, which is a sort of a kind of a tabard that the priests wore. And it may be that he was possibly dressed just in the ephod, although we cannot be 100% sure on that point. When the ark reaches its final resting place, in the tent that David has had constructed for it, David once again makes a sacrifice to God, and then he blesses the people and distributes food amongst them. Now you might think that that's then the end of the story, but there's still one final kind of strange little bit where we're told that David's first wife, Michal, who has obviously not been part of the celebration, she sort of looks out and sees what is going on, and she despised him in her heart. She then accuses him of humiliating himself. But David tells her that he was dancing before the Lord, and that in order to honour God, he would be willing to become even more undignified than this. Now, there's a lot going on there, isn't there? So let's just try and look at it in a little bit more detail to see if we can make some kind of sense of it. The first thing to look at is the death of Uzar, which seems to be, to me at least, a particularly harsh response to what I think is just a kind of natural reaction if you were to see something that was about to fall. You know, you would put your hand out, wouldn't you, and try and catch it. But to help us understand it, we need to look back to what has happened before that point in the story. And this perhaps is also the key to understanding the whole passage. Back in Numbers chapter 5, the Israelites were given really specific instructions about how to transport the ark when they're carrying it from place to place. The ark wasn't meant to be put on a cart. It was supposed to be carried by priests on poles. With the ark on their back, the priests could feel the weight of God's presence with them. The only people who had previously put the ark on a cart were the Philistines. The second mistake that the Israelites made was forgetting to offer a sacrifice. They were kind of singing and dancing and making a huge racket, but they hadn't taken the time to do things properly. They'd sort of taken the quick and the easy options instead. It was almost like David wanted all the benefits of the ark, but he didn't want to invest in the work or the time or the money that the institution of the ark demanded. And ultimately, it is Uzar who pays the price for this. Not for the first time, and certainly not for the last time in history. It is those lower down the pecking order who pay the price and who suffer the consequences for the mistakes of those at the top. David's second attempt then to bring the ark to Jerusalem is different. This time he dresses himself in an ephod, in a kind of priestly outfit, which served as a sign that he was taking this treasure seriously. Next, he gave up on the cart. The ark was going to be carried. And finally, after those who had sort of carried the ark had taken 6 steps, they stop, and David offers a sacrifice. And then only once David had taken these steps, only once he had yoked himself to the institution of the ark, did he dance. And that then leads to the confrontation with Michal and the confusion over whether or not David was wearing anything other than just the ephod. Because Michal accuses David of uncovering himself before the eyes of his servants, as any vulgar fellow might shamelessly uncover himself. Now, that could be a reference to David dancing around half naked, wearing nothing but his ephod. But actually, I think that Michal's anger is because as the procession makes its way into Jerusalem, David was dancing, as was everyone else, and he was wearing a priest's robe rather than his kingly attire. In other words, there was nothing in either his behaviour or in his attire that marked him out as being a king. There was nothing that distinguished him from anyone else within that procession. And David's response here to Michal's accusation, for the most part, is good. And it is key to understanding the difference between the first attempt at moving the ark and the second, as well as understanding what I believe that we can take from this passage this morning. However, before we look at that response, it is perhaps worth just acknowledging that although Michal had grown to despise David, she had once loved him enough to risk her own life to help him to escape from her father Saul. And whilst there is much good in David's response, there are, I think, also clues as to his behaviour toward her, which may well have led her to despising him. We're told, for instance, that Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no child to the day of her death. And whilst that is kind of often read as being some sort of punishment on her for her outburst against David here, I think it's also possible that David, who had many children with many different wives, deliberately chose not to have relations with her because of who her father was, and the risk, therefore, of continuing the line of Saul. David also notes to Michal, in response to her accusation of him kind of dishonouring himself, that by the maids of whom you have spoken, I shall be held in honour. In other words, I think he's kind of pointing out that due to his position, he will not lack for female attention, displaying perhaps the first signs of an attitude that really comes to the fore when we get a little bit later in the story to the incident with Bathsheba. But the main thrust of his response is that this is not about him. The procession with the ark is about honouring God and not David. And therefore there is no need for him to feel humiliated by the way that he danced or the way that he dressed, because the focus was on God. And that is the way that it should be. It perhaps tells us the difference between the two attempts at moving the ark too. You see, in the first attempt, I think the focus was on David. And he wanted it that way. This was his chance to show the nation of Israel that he was favoured by God, that his city was going to be the holy city. And in his rush to do that, to demonstrate all of that to the people of Israel, he forgot to focus on God. He forgot to take his time, to do things properly. However, in the second attempt, David leads the people not to see how great he is, but he leads them in worship and praise of God. He steps down from his lofty position as king in order to lift God up to his rightful place as the true leader of the people. And that perhaps is also the key thing for us to take from this rather strange story from the life of David. Might we seek after the heart of God by taking the time to listen to God, not rushing on with our own plans and doing just what we want to do, but instead keeping our eyes always fixed on him. And might our worship never become about us and about what we want and what we like and about what we think. Might we see that worship is not just about the songs that we sing or about coming to church every Sunday, but that it is instead about the attitude of our hearts. And then might we seek in all that we do to lift God high, to honour him by taking the time to do things right, even if that means that sometimes we have to humble ourselves. And as we do that, might we also be willing to accept the invitation from the Lord of the dance to join with him in the dance of life. Amen.